Good evening, everyone. We're going to do our family devotional, and this is going to be a little different. A lot of times I made it a little more kid-friendly, but I wanted to talk about this idea of this theology of church and state, kind of separation of church and state, as we're going through an interesting time in our country. And I remember years ago, in 2005, I actually wrote a research paper on this in grad school. So I wanted to just talk about a little about this idea of defining church and state separation. And you kind of have the state, you have the church, the ecclesia, and it became a major issue kind of when America kind of started forming, and you had a lot of the people coming down to look for religious freedom away from the king or the state. And so that was kind of the root of this idea of church and state separation. Classically, churches of Christ have been more separating church and state. If you look at some of the influencers of the movement, they did not really want anything to do with political matters, or they kind of saw all civil government to be demonic and illegitimate, almost as a threat to the reign of God in this world. And then you had kind of the second generation of leader, David Lipscomb, and he was very much kind of a pacifist, refused to vote, considered the state to be aligned with Satan. And so he felt so strongly that he wrote a whole book kind of denouncing Christians' involvement in politics. Now, in World War I, you see kind of the churches of Christ. They had somewhat of a political revolution between World War I, and they were still classically not engaged in the political realm. It wasn't something that they wanted to take their time with. Now, some of it because of the social dynamics, too. A lot of those in the churches of Christ did not have a lot of wealth, and so they did not have a lot of influence. But in World War II, you saw a major shift where in World War I, a lot of members of the church did not fight and were opposed to the war and would not take up arms. But in World War II, it kind of turned, and a lot of people became much more patriotic during that phase in the history. But really, I want to kind of look at four ways to interact in the state. And so we're going to look at kind of four basic concepts of how much should Christians be involved in the state. And the first one is called the indirect and unintentional mode. And this means that Christians in the church only attempt to affect politics through their character. So essentially, by living as a Christian man or woman, by demonstrating your character, that's the only type of involvement you have in the political realm in society. Then the next level of engagement is the indirect and intentional. And this is the church does not attempt to teach the members the social implications of their Christian beliefs. So the church, through teaching morality, through teaching correct conduct, that's how people speak up, through their individual lives. So it's much more a Christian can influence the state or politics, but it's their job as individuals in their own conscience or in their own choice. Now, the third level is the direct and intentional method, and this is more the corporate conscience of the congregation. So in contrast to level 2, where it's more just individuals, making their decisions, how they vote, what they protest, what they fight for. Now it becomes kind of a united movement in the congregation. And so you kind of come together as the church because it says, hey, if this is good for us individually, this should be good for us as a church. So that's the third level of influence that people have in the world. And then the final one, the fourth type of influence, is the direct and intentional influence. And it kind of ups the we're going to join and fight this. Now it's the idea of the church using its power to create change in this world. So it's almost we should coerce others and use the institutional power, money, staff, and members to sway public policy according to its will. So you kind of see the 4 different levels of involvements that takes place. Now there's some scripture that really influences our thinking on this, and that's Romans 13 verses 1 to 4, and you could look up those verses. Acts chapter 5 verse 29, we must obey God rather than men. That is usually discussed in how Christians should influence politics. Then you also have in 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 13 to 17, Christians who speak on political topics, as long as they do not change the message of the gospel into a political agenda. So there's some boundaries there that Scripture gives to us. And then you have Matthew chapter 17, verse 24 to 27, and Jesus deals with this idea of paying taxes. So Jesus was willing to be submissive to the laws of the land, and people discuss that. And so you have, lots of Scripture and all that, but mostly I just wanted to talk to you a little about this idea. It's really quite a complex concept of how the church engages with the state and our political involvement. And so if you want, I have this whole paper, and I wrote it many, many years ago, about 15 years ago. And if you'd like a copy of it, why don't you email me? You can email me at mmorine@hotmail.com, and I'll be happy to send it to you. And maybe you'd like to kind of study on that topic a little deeper than just kind of an either or, kind of think through what level of involvement you'd like to, be involved in with yourself. So thanks for tuning in, and if you'd like to get that paper emailed to you about the church and state separation and the theology of church and state, I'd love to do that. So why don't you email me if you'd like. Appreciate you tuning in this evening.